Luke, and Raj, thank you very much for the opening talk there. I thought that was a really good stage setting for the presentations today, and the overall goal of understanding what geologic carbon storage is and what the national labs are doing. So today I'm going to talk about a small portion of the research that's being done at NETL, the National Energy Technology Laboratory. This is work that I'm most involved with, but I'm going to touch on some of the larger things that are going on at NETL with carbon sequestration as well. So to begin with, I think I'm the first one in this little mini symposium from NETL, so I wanted to give a very short introduction to NETL in case someone didn't know exactly what it was. It's our national lab mission is specifically focused on fossil energy resources, and one of our main things that we do is act as the funding arm of the Department of Energy Fossil Energy Office. So as such, as Raj mentioned, we are a government-operated lab. Can you hear me okay? I thought I heard something. Cool.
Dr. Dustin, could you turn off the video? I think you are lagging a little due to bandwidth.
I think I just turned it off. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's fine. Thank you.
Okay, cool. And the thumbs up I just gave you probably didn't come through then. But hopefully this works better. I do apologize to everyone. I am at my in-laws' house in rural upstate New York, so I don't think I have the the bandwidth that I would normally have in more of a urban area. Anyway, NETL, fossil energy focus, government operated, which is a little different than labs, but long story short, it doesn't really matter much. We were originally combined from some Bureau of Mines and energy technology centers going back roughly 100 years. And it's been a long-term problem looking at fossil energy, be it coal production, be it syngas production, be it coal mine safety. These are various things that NETL has looked at over the past decades and decades. For the past 20 plus years, carbon storage has been one of the main things that we've been interested in, and that's what I'll be talking about today. And final thought about NETL is we are a fairly small national laboratory. We've got about 1,400 employees, and we are dispersed across the country. There's an research office in Albany, Oregon, one in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and then where I'm at in Morgantown, West Virginia, home of WVU. I'm personally a mechanical engineer, so I'm not coming from a geology background, which has been kind of fun to be working on this for 20 years at this point. I got my master's looking at solar thermal storage and rock beds, and then moving into my PhD, I was looking at multi-phase transport in porous media and fractures, primarily computationally. So I was doing a lot of direct numerical simulations through complicated geometries, understanding what was going on with immiscible flow, drainage, imbibition, et cetera, and so forth. I've been at NETL in Morgantown now, so for like I said, almost 20 years. Starting off as a PhD student, then I was a postdoc, moved on to being a contractor, and then for about the past 7 or 8 years, I've been a federal employee. And each one of these roles has been a little bit different, and I've really moved on from doing mostly numerical work to more experimental, and this has really been focused around, especially the last 15 years, computed tomography scanning. So CT scanning at NETL is one of the main kind of threads I'm going to talk about today. As such, I want to introduce it a little bit more detail at the beginning here. The first CT scanner was installed at NETL 2007, and this was a medical CT scanner, same thing you would find in a hospital. We got a micro CT scanner a couple of years later, and then an industrial CT scanner a couple of years after that. We've been very fortunate over the past decade plus at this point to have people like myself who have been involved with it since the beginning. And also we've had a wide variety of students, faculty, visiting researchers come in and work with us on various projects over the years. So it's been a wonderful opportunity to have a base around something that we can continue to build off of and get fresh ideas and thoughts in through people. students such as yourself to come in and really work on interesting problems. Here are the fun toys we get to play with in a little more detail. So we have the micro CT scanner down here at the bottom. This is a system that we can look at a sub-micron scale. We can look inside of pores, actually pull out some of the pore space, perfect for porting over to direct numerical simulations or some simplified models of fluid flow. Very, very detailed and data-rich information that we get from there. The industrial CT scanner, typically run that around 10 micron resolution, 10 to 20 micron resolution. Not so good at getting individual pores out, but we can start to see changes in structures pretty rapidly. So very good for seeing dynamic processes such as geochemical alteration or geomechanical alteration. The medical scanner, pictured over here, is a very coarse resolution scanner to the other two. We're typically dealing around a couple hundred micron resolution, but with the loss in resolution, we do get an increase in speed. A medical scan we can get done on the order of 30 seconds. Industrial CT scanner takes about an hour to 2 hours, and a micro CT scan can take 4 to 8 hours. Also, we're looking at a sample about the size of a pencil eraser, typically with the micro CT scanner. We're looking at 1 or 1.5 inch diameter samples with the industrial CT scanner. And with the medical scanner, we can look at a 4-inch diameter core and hundreds of feet of it. So we get a real nice multi-scale evaluation of the rocks that we're interested in. And that's what I'm trying to highlight here. In addition to the CT scanning, we do have facilities that allow us to do some core logging inside of a geotech multi-sensor core logger. So we can get P-wave measurements, we can get gamma density, we can get a whole bunch of typical downhole measurements at fairly fine resolution. So it's typically something where we can look at a couple of centimeters, 6 centimeter resolution of these properties I just talked about. In addition, there's a handheld XRF that we can get some measurements on, allows for very detailed core characterization. And then the final thing I want to note on this slide is each and every one of our systems over the years we've built up to be able to look at real rocks under representative subsurface conditions. So we can use elevated pressure, elevated temperature, or lower temperature if we're looking at like hydrate formation, for example. And you can see that in the core holders that are inside of the various systems here. So these are Hassler style core holders that allow us to do controlled fluid flow and control the pressure and situation of the rock that we're dealing with. So that's a broad overview of the CT scanning capabilities. Here's some quick examples of some work we've done over the past 5-6 years. On the left, and we're going to be coming back to this later on in the talk, specifically for CO2 transport. But here are some examples of using the medical CT scanner to look at dynamic fluid migration inside of cores. On the top, we have CO2 moving through a core. You can see the bedding planes are at an angle, and it's kind of, partially filling up that structure. On the bottom, we've actually engineered the viscosity ratio between the fluids, where now it's not just CO2, but CO2 with a surfactant that is displacing through a very similar core to what you're seeing up top here, but you're getting a very different type of fluid migration pattern. So this system allows us to do things like understand how CO2 would naturally move through structures that we care about, and understand what we can do to engineer perhaps a better situation if we want to get more CO2 into a specific area, be that for carbon storage or enhanced oil recovery. In the upper right, I'm showing some of the work that we've done over the past couple of years looking at that core characterization. So this is an instance where we can put hundreds of feet of core into the medical scanner and get fairly detailed, sub-millimeter resolution 3D images of those structures. And then we make those publicly available, and I'll have a link for that later on in the talk as well. And then finally down here, some work that we've done over the past year is looking at wellbore integrity. So as Raj was talking about, wellbores can be one of the potential leakage pathways going from the subsurface up. Understanding how and what controls the ability for a fluid to move through these systems, move through cements is important. Here we're looking at a 3-foot long section of foamed cement, so cement with a significant portion of nitrogen bubbles added to it. That was created through collaboration with some industrial partners. And what you see is kind of a high porosity zone going across the entire length of that sample. If we zoom in using our multi-scale system with the industrial CT scanner to 1 centimeter cube of that structure, what we can start to do is really pull out some of the individual bubbles and the understanding of what that structure looks like. So that's an example of how we're able to do some multi-scale work. Up top here is an example of one thing that we've done in the industrial scanner, looking at geomechanical deformation. We developed a fairly simple little device to shear rocks under elevated pressures while flowing fluid through them. So we're looking at a cross section of a rock here that's undergoing shear. This is an image of the fracture plane where the colors indicate the local aperture as it undergoes shear. And this has been a nice little bit of work that I'm not going to talk about beyond this today. But just, I like showing it as a representation of the ability to look at geomechanical alteration with systems such as this. And then over on the left, we have a shale gas example where we're actually looking at geochemical alteration. We have our core flow system over here where you have a very controlled injection of, in this case, fracturing fluids into a shale. We measure fluids coming out the backside, calculate or measure from that what the mineral concentrations are in the effluent. And we CT scan before and after doing a week-long flow in this case to understand where we're getting actual alteration. So in this case, we're seeing the green area. So the yellow is a fracture right here. The green is area on the top or the bottom of that fracture that have been dissolved away. The red is the proppant holding that fracture up. And we actually have a, what I think of as like a flow shield of barite that's formed as barium has interacted in some fashion with the shale, dropped out a solution, and created this hindrance to flow through the system. So again, just an example of some geochemical alteration, in this case for a shale gas recovery example. And then final detailed examples for the micro CT scanner. We're actually going to get into this in much more detail in a couple more minutes, so I'm not going to spend time on it. But with the ability to look at the complex natural structure of pores that make up the the space inside of rocks where fluids can move and we care about, such as this piece of Mount Simon sandstone here, where we're just looking at the open pore space, we can actually look at how CO2, or supercritical CO2 in this case, gets trapped inside of these structures, and what we can know about the ability to trap what percentage of the pore space with CO2 is what we're interested in. So this is an example that I'll get into later. And then I talked about earlier the ability to take these complex natural structures, port them over to either simplified numerical models such as this ball and stick model, or direct numerical simulation. And I should put up an example here of some lattice Boltzmann modeling too. And then finally at the top, we're looking at a very discrete geochemical alteration with this system as well. So I mentioned that I'm only going to be talking about a small portion of the carbon storage research, but I did want to show this slide up here briefly. This is some of the in-house research that's being done at NETL. I touched on wellbore integrity, but I'm not going to talk about that anymore. Subsurface stress, both in terms of the laboratory scale that we're looking at here, but also some larger scale measurements, and then monitoring, secure storage, et cetera, and so forth is a big part as well. Our laboratory work is primarily in the plume detection and storage efficiency realm, and we're really looking at the small scale laboratory work. By we, I'm saying the people in the lab that I work in. But at NETL, there is some work being done at taking those fundamental storage properties, applying larger scale screening applications to understand what the total amount of storage is in the United States. And this usually comes out in the Carbon Storage Atlas. There's a really nice, an Appendix E of the Atlas from 2 years ago or something like that. Really nice methodology that's laid forth on how we can screen and we can screen the ability we can come up with realistic estimates of what the overall storage capacity is within the United States based upon limited information that we have of the reservoirs that we want to put dioxide into. CO2 screen is more of a field scale application of this using the same efficiency factors, and all of the laboratory work that we're doing really tries to feed into this larger scale vision. CO2 trapping is one of those, so where we can get those individual droplets of supercritical CO2, measure properties we care about, isolate mineral components and geometries of these structures to get relative permeability information, and then get that out to screen or some of these larger scale estimations. Same with understanding how CO2 moves in more of a bulk structure. We do that core characterization that I talked about, measure and understand the properties of those cores, run flow through these, so typically supercritical CO2 brine flow, to develop relative permeability curves, make those publicly available, both the raw data and the derived relative permeability curves, and try to get that information out there in public so people can use it in their estimation of risk and understanding of where and how CO2 is going to move through the subsurface in places we care about. So all that's kind of lead up to what I'm really planning on talking about, so kind of a long lead up. I'm going to talk in more detail about the pore scale multi-phase transport. So this is using the micro CT, and where we're really trying to understand how those individual droplets of CO2 reside in the pore spaces and what we can learn about that from realistic conditions of real rocks under real conditions, experiments, and how can we understand something about that structure to understand how CO2 is going to move and interact in that space. And then also going to talk a little more about the core scale supercritical CO2 displacement studies we've done. So this is a series of studies we've done over the years where we're really looking at developing relative permeability curves and making those publicly available, and some pretty cool things that we've been able to figure out with that I'll get into. So for the individual pore scale trapping, some of the primary objectives of what we've been looking at over the past 4 or 5 years at this point is understanding what varies in how CO2 gets trapped in different spaces. We know that if a rock has 20% porosity as opposed to 5% porosity, you're likely going to be able to get more CO2 into that space. But what controls the percentage of that space that actually gets occupied by CO2? There are interactions of pore level connectivity, how the individual pores are connected. There are interactions of the minerals that make the rock and how that CO2 actually stays in that structure. So what we're showing over here is an individual droplet of supercritical CO2. What we've done here in the visualization is shown in partially translucent material, the individual grains of rock that are touching that and holding that CO2 droplet in place. And then there's these little rings here, which are the actual contact lines all around the CO2 droplet that are holding that CO2 droplet in place. And we look at 2D images of it, and it would look like this, and you have individual contact lines and points that is along those grains. But in real life, it's a 3-dimensional structure that's being held in there. Once we start looking around at the contact angles here and seeing how all that varies, there's a lot of variation between the individual contact angle measurements all around this droplet. Some of it's geometry based, some of it's mineral based, and parsing that out is one of the things that we're most interested in. And I think it's kind of nice showing here the contrast between the two. We're not talking about a very simple sessile drop measurement where you have a perfect substrate of some sort on the top here and a droplet of CO2 with set contact angles. You have a wide variety of those contact angles in real natural structures. So what we're doing is we're measuring those. We're trapping CO2 inside of cores that we do larger scale flow-through tests on as well. Here's the core holder that we use in the micro CT scanner. This takes a core that's a couple of millimeters in diameter. We do controlled CO2 injection, controlled brine injection, and get down to a residual saturation point. Identify and find CO2 droplets inside of that structure, perform measurements. We've also done some work in the past couple of years mapping mineral content to that and porting these over to simulations. The whole reason for doing this is eventually we would like to have some knowledge when we just look at the rock to begin with about how CO2 is going to be trapped and move through that structure. So we're doing all this work here to try to get to the point where we can do some more predictions just based upon the cuttings that we get out of the rock, the knowledge that we have of that formation, whatever it may be. Overall approach, I just kind of went through this, but we have the micro CT scanner system with the core holder, get that down to a residual saturation point through a very set and rigorous experimental technique, image, analyze, and pull that information out with the relative goal of the ultimate goal of understanding the relative weighting of pore-to-core scale properties, so we can better understand a priori how much storage we're going to get in set locations. Excuse me. Previous to this work and going on tangentially to it, we've done a lot of work over the past 5+ years just doing CO2 trapping. So we have a really nice open data set of droplets of CO2 we can go into and measure this information out. We've also come up with some fairly straightforward ways of taking the pore structure that we have and porting over to lattice Boltzmann simulations, and just some fairly simple Stokes flow simulations as well to get the flow and dynamic properties of the set structure. So we've got that kind of taken care of and have a number of publications out on that. And in addition to looking at this, and I talked about this before, we do with the medical CT scanner and the core logger, beg, borrow, and steal, or not steal, but beg and borrow as many cores as we can of relevant subsurface locations associated with carbon storage. And Raj mentioned this before, but the carbon safe for the United States are one of the most relevant and recent examples of how we are able to digitally capture and image the structure of cores captured at those carbon safe sites, all non-destructively, and then we make that data publicly available. This is all available on the EDX website, the Energy Data Exchange, which is what NETL uses to get information out there. Here's 3 recent examples, fairly recent examples of carbon storage sites. We've got a couple more that we need to get out on very recent carbon safe projects. Here's an example of some of the core logging information. But I just wanted to mention this, as this could be very useful for a variety of reasons, not only what we're talking about here, but the understanding of the structure and how that impacts what we're looking at for specific carbon storage sites, but for a variety of other scoping exercises that folks may be interested in. So here's, I think, 3 different recent publications I wanted to show to highlight this. This first one here is really purely experimental. And that's where we were trying to understand how the pore structure influences the curvature of these trapped ganglia of fluid. And we did that with what we wanted to see as well as when we inject more water into a system, when we perturb it, how does that change the amount of CO2 that's trapped in the space and the shape and locations of those CO2 trapped ganglia. So there were 2 very different samples we looked at. One is a Bentheimer, one is a nugget sandstone, both are sandstones. You see a scale bar of about 500 microns here in this image. And the black zones here are the supercritical CO2. The lighter gray is rock minerals. I have some higher density minerals there, be it pyrite or something like that. And the medium gray is brine inside of that pore structure. So what we see here is some isolated droplets of CO2 after a first drainage imbibition cycle. Fair amount in the Bentheimer, much less in the nugget. And then after running one more drainage imbibition cycle, we find a lot more CO2 is trapped inside of that system. We want to understand why and what was different between the first perturbation and the second perturbation of getting CO2 inside of the structure. For carbon storage, we want to get more to a location where we're filling up and keeping as much CO2 inside of that rock as possible. So that was the interest. Over here, we have some analysis of how those droplets actually changed in structure using a oblate versus prolate mapping here, where you see they slowly shift over to a more oblate type of behavior. Here's a specific example of a pore that moved, or CO2 droplet that moved during this structure during the cycle inside of the Nugget Sandstone. And you can see the contact angle changed a little bit during this cycling. Here's another example of that, where we have CO2 droplets that are trapped here. So I should explain this. Here we have different slices, 2D slices of that three-dimensional structure. During the first cycle and the second cycle, we were looking to see how that CO2 droplet grew and what changed in the amount of fluid and how it interacted. Long story short, there's much more details in the paper, but contact angle of the second drainage imbibition cycle was increased with respect to supercritical CO2. And we saw that structures such as dead-end pores really didn't change much, but where you had a significant amount of connectivity, a significant number of small throats in between the larger pores, that's where you had the greatest change in the overall volume and amount of CO2 in these ganglia, individual ganglia. This is another study similar, where we wanted to understand from the experiments, how did the variability in just the contact angle influence the ability of these CO2 droplets to stay wedged inside of the pore space. So we took a very computational view of this and just varied the distribution of the spatial correlation of this distribution of contact angles through a realistic three-dimensional geometry that we obtained from the CT scanning. Increasing the length scale, which is indicative of a more minerally heterogeneous core, resulted in a slightly different trapping of CO2 inside of the system. But overall, here's the relative permeability curves here. There was not a huge change by just changing kind of blindly through this spatial correlation length, the distribution of contact angles through this structure. So some change with just changing contact angle, but not a whole bunch when we do it uniformly as we did here. So we looked again at this question of contact angle, and we coupled that not only with the variation spatially, but we wanted to understand if we have contact angle variations of different minerals inside of the pore space, did that influence what we saw as far as how CO2, how fluids in general, multi-phase fluid transport would change inside the structure. So here we have high resolution CT imaging, and then a coarser resolution QSEM imaging of the same system. And what this QESEM allowed us to do was identify where we had clay, where we had quartz, and where we had feldspar inside of the structure. I'm going to focus on the kaolinite, the clays, because that's what we focused on and changed the contact angle for. And what you can see here is in the this kind of three-dimensional volume, the clays are actually filling a fairly small part of the volume. It's only 10% of the volume, but it's in these critical locations where the throats are, the pathways between the larger pores, is where that clay tended to reside inside of this system. So we made lattice Boltzmann simulations, and we assigned contact angles depending on the mineralogy to the individual locations inside of the simulation. And here's what we see when we change the contact angle of just the clays inside of those refined throats. Initially when we have a kind of a neutral wetting angle, we have this blue structure over here. But when we start increasing it to make those clays non-wetting to CO2, make it harder for that CO2 to move through, we get a change in the relative permeability curve over to the much lower saturation. So it gets harder for CO2 to move through this structure. So coupling together the mineral distribution and the influence that has on how CO2 is moving through that structure has a significant impact. It's not only the pore structure, it's not only the connectivity, but it's what is in those places that can be really controlling of how much CO2 or any fluid can move through that location. So ongoing, as part of the SMART initiative that Raj talked about, we are doing some more work with this, really focusing on a couple of systems that we have larger scale data for as well. One is the Vetter Sandstone, which is an equivalent to the Kimberlina field site. So kind of neat to be able to do that. And then this other one is this Bell Creek system up in North Dakota, where we have a lot of seismic data, a lot of well log, and we're hoping what we find from the small scale can be applied to work that's being done there as well. So that's what we've done with that's where we're at with looking at some of the pore scale features. In the core scale, I talked about this earlier on when I introduced the medical CT scanner. And again, this is a coarse system, and it now enables us to look very quickly, roughly every 30 seconds, of how CO2 is moving through a rock core. That we have images here and here of that. We've done a series of tests over the past, it's about 4 years at this point, of various rock types that are associated with depositional environments that may be used across the United States for CO2 storage. We've made all that raw data, the CT data, available on this website here, and we've calculated relative permeability curves of these. I'm going to talk about that process to kind of wrap up my portion of the symposium here today. The methodology is, the experimental methodology is laid out kind of right here. Again, we have a core holder with a controlled temperature, pressure inside of a CT scanner. Before doing any testing, we got to go through and rigorously mix together CO2 and brine and CO2, so they are both saturated with each other. And then inject, inject into that core, either CO2 saturated brine or brine saturated CO2. CT scan it while we're doing that. And from that, we can get actually a plot such as is down here, where this would be the injection side on the left, effluent side on the right. And as we inject more and more brine into the system in this case, we get a higher and higher CT number. That CT number can be correlated to the change in saturation inside the core. You got, kind of a pretty animation of that going on over here as well. There's a whole bunch of image processing that then goes into calculating out what the actual saturation of CO2 is inside the core. So here the CT number is the registered grayscale value per pixel inside of the system. And we can get, once we get a baseline CT image, and we can subtract one where we know there's brine in there, calculate the porosity, and then calculate, voxel by voxel, where voxel is a volume pixel, how much CO2 is actually in that system. So have a whole bunch of macros built up to do that, and it's a pretty fun process to kind of see, how we can take something where we can make a pretty image of it, as I showed on the last screen here, to something where we actually have a quantifiable value of saturation. Once we know how much CO2 volume we have inside the structure, we actually use a methodology that was developed for unsteady relative permeability calculations, developed in the late 90s, early 2000s, where we developed, where we calculate a couple of parameters, these alphas and betas, to then calculate what the relative permeability is. This whole process is laid out in this diagram here, where we have a whole slew of experimental properties that we go through that image processing to calculate the saturations to get the volume properties we're interested in, get those alpha and betas, and then we do that to calculate the mobility ratios and go through the relative permeability calculations. All this math, all this detail is on the COBRA website and in a couple of publications we've got out there as well. But what we end up with is something like this. So I'm just going to go through a couple of relative permeability curves and talk about what it is that we're seeing in these, you know, kind of boring looking line plots here. So we're going to start off with the Navajo Sandstone. This is an aeolian sandstone, fairly low-ish permeability, not super high anyway for a good reservoir rock. You can see that we've got, you know, a fairly small amount of CO2 saturation inside the system. You know, we're only getting up to 20% supercritical CO2 before we can't inject any more into it. But wait a minute, for this 2 millimeter per minute test, we've actually got quite a bit more. What we're seeing in here is actually an influence of the way that this rock was created. So this aeolian sandstone, I should have a picture here of what that CO2 plume looks like to kind of aid this. But what we're seeing here is primary migration along certain bedding planes of the structure. When we inject at a high rate, we really kind of blast that CO2 in there and we get multiple bedding planes filled up. But farther down here at lower injection rates, we're only filling up a very small portion of that overall porosity, because we're only going through these much more open bedding planes, and we're kind of short-circuiting the rest of the pore structure inside of the system, resulting in a much lower overall relative permeability. Castlegate Sandstone, again, we've got a fairly low-ish injection rate, or I'm sorry, saturation of CO2 inside of these structures. But here we've got a different problem. We've got a, you know, almost a Darcy permeability sandstone. So this is a very open and, you know, fairly high porosity, 25% system, where it's just taken everything and then you know, it's only filling up about half of it due to the pore structure itself. So I'm sorry, a quarter of the overall porosity by the pore structure itself, but it is flowing through the entire thing. So you're not seeing that as much of that bedding plane migration as we were with the Navajo. And then the Edwards yellow is a different beast altogether. So this one is a carbonate reef structure. The order of the test that we ran with this was a 6 millimeter per minute, 4 millimeter per minute, and 2 millimeter per minute. And you can see as we're going along here, we get very different type of relative permeability curves. And the reason why that is the reason why we've got asterisks here. Being a carbonate structure, CO2 acidified brine actually created wormholes inside of the system. So with our very first test, we were able to get, you know, at this fairly low permeability, good sweep efficiency, 60%-ish filled with CO2. You know, overall, a pretty good rock to hold a bunch of CO2. But as we resaturated that core and flushed back through with CO2 acidified brine, we had wormholes that short-circuited the CO2 and allowed for less of that overall structure to be filled up. We rinsed the core out again, repeated. We had another continuation of that wormhole, and that you know, meant that we had even less CO2 stored in that overall structure. And what that looks like from the CT perspective in 2D is like this. So this is top here is the injection side of the core. Here's initially after just a little bit of CO2 brine injection, you get a little bit of a wormhole forming. Here's after that second full test, you have even more open structure. And here's, you know, at the final test, you have this flow pathway that's going down a significant portion of the core and reducing the ability for CO2 to kind of bebop along and fill up more of that overall pore structure. So here's another example of a similar type of structure that we saw that in, and this is from an Austin chalk. Down on the bottom here, rotating slowly, is that, you know, very beautiful dendritic wormhole structure of you know, open pore space inside of the system that is created as carbonic acid, CO2 acidified brine, rips away some of that internal structure. We've got a publication that's in review for this right now, but what we're able to do with this is, because we can maintain the system while we get these changes in porosity, we can calculate that change in porosity, calculate the change in permeability, and then go back in and calculate how these geometric alterations due to geochemical behavior inside the system alters the relative permeability, which I don't think has ever been done in quite this way. And we're pretty excited about being able to do this. And hopefully this gets published soon and we can continue to do more work on it. But yeah, that's where we're at with this. As I mentioned before, we make all this data available on the CO2 brine relative permeability accessible database. The link is right up there. You know, again, we have a wide variety of samples. So the Austin chalk I just showed is there, Navajo, Castlegate, etc. We have the flow data, the saturation data, and then pore volume correction for those that need it are there. And I think with that, I'm actually done. So hopefully that was of interest. And if there are any questions, I would be more than happy to take them. So yeah, thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, Dr. Dustin. I'm gonna try to get to one question before the next one. If you guys have more questions, I see more questions posted. Please feel free to email Dr. Dustin. So I think Latana had the question. He said, do you run simulations to replicate the time-lapse CT results?
We do. We run simulations. We've used everything from Tough to Fluent to Last Boltzmann multi-phase transport to simulate what we're seeing.
Okay, perfect. Let's see if we can get to one more.
I'll try to.
We'll do Deborah's question. On slide 17, for image analysis, do you use in-house program to analyze or commercially available software? And do you also look into the effect of mineralogy on CO2 trapping, especially in clay presence?
Yep, and I got into the looking at the mineralogy. We definitely do that. We have and I'm not a geochemist, as I talked about. I'm a lowly mechanical engineer, but we have some great geochemists at NETL. For the image processing, we do our best to use open source software wherever we can. So we're talking ImageJ, we're talking Fiji, and then for segmentation, we talk Elastic. A couple of reasons why we do that. One, we like the ability to know what's going on underneath the hood inside the software. And with open source, you have more of that capability as opposed to a commercial piece of software. Two, working with universities and other people, we like for them to have the ability to use the same thing that we're doing, and open source takes care of that.
Perfect. Thank you, Dr. Dustin. It was a pleasure. I'm going to introduce our...
This is great. Really appreciate it, and thanks everyone for showing up.
Absolutely.